Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. I do believe this is the 100th video in our second Master Series, the 49th video on basic processors, the 12th video on sculpting processors, and the second video on noise. And in this segment, we are going to look at noise processors. So the first one we're going to look at is automation. Okay, first of all, we are going to have a segment in our processors as using the DAW4 processor. But before we get to that, you're going to need to familiarize yourself a little bit with the automation tools in your DAW. So basically, it's pretty simple. You need to go there and see how to visualize the automation, how your DAW is going to visualize the automation, how you're going to draw the automation, how you're either going to freehand it, line, parabola, square. I mean, the tools that you have to actually run automation, how you're visualizing it and which different parameters you can visualize, how to add and remove them, things like that. And automation itself is read, touch, latch, and write. These are really simple concepts that you're just going to want to familiarize yourself with, because most of the automation we're going to be doing is very simple. There may be some other areas in your DAW that allow you to adjust automation, things turning automation on and off. You may be able to get onto your tracks and actually look at automation lanes as separate tracks and things like that. That would be the automation you were just seeing up here. Now it's down on a separate envelope, down on underneath it. Your DAW may be able to do some of those kind of things rather than just see it on the track itself. And you may be able to get in your mixing console, and it may have some areas for you to adjust parameters as far as your automation tools and affect the automation. So you kind of want to read about it in your manual and doing your research you need on the internet just to look at it. We'll be looking at it in depth when we look at the DAW as a tool. But when we apply this automation, it's going to be pretty simple work, so it's not going to be really complicated, so you're not going to have to be a master of automation at this moment. You're just going to need to understand the concept. Later, when you go and look at the DAW, that you'll get a much deeper understanding of the automation abilities of your DAW. But for now, just get a pretty basic understanding of how to apply the things we're talking about, and you'll see that we're not doing any really super difficult type of automation when we do these noise files. So let's take a look at some other considerations. Another huge consideration we've already talked about was splitting the frequency. Whenever you're adding noise from these tracks, that you can very simply band pass that noise to the areas that it needs to. And on top of that, maybe your DAW has something like a channel splitter or a frequency splitter. So I can actually work on this in the upper range like this has, that I've band passed my EQ, but I can just allow it to pass there. And on the other side, I can drop it down to 0, so none of the noise from basically down in here is passing through, and just noise from the frequency range up here is passing through on the other side. And I could be using that in conjunction with an EQ, or I could just be using the EQ itself, either way. But it's a consideration whenever you're working with these tracks. You know, there's many things that you could do on those individual tracks, but equalization and frequency splitting and things like that are some of the biggest tools that you have whenever you're applying noise from one track to mix into the mix of whatever you're trying to bring the noise into. So let's take a look at some other considerations. Okay, so let's take a look at automating some noise onto a track. The first thing is, when we get done here, we're going to go ahead and listen to this. So you want to get out your headphones, then we're going to do some applying of it. But for right now, what we're going to do is just want to look at writing the automation. It's pretty simple, as far as your automation is concerned. It's a pretty simple application. Normally, that you've got someplace way to visualize your automation, and there's a couple different things you want to take in consideration. First of all, I normally set my DAWs to sample view because I can get the most detailed work normally in sample view, get down to the smallest increment of time, because sometimes I need to, sometimes I don't. And there's a couple of different ways to do it. If you look here on here, I have written out the automation really close to the way the waveform is going along here. And if you look at this next one, that it's the same file, but I've not followed it quite so closely. And one thing you really want to take in consideration, that you really want to watch out for peaks. Any kind of peaks you don't really want to follow because you'll get spikes and noise. So I normally will follow along underneath the waveform, and any peaks and things like that I really try to stay way away from so I don't get noise spikes. And I kind of follow, it's like if you ever look at a waveform that goes dink, 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 that, you know, it's like a smoothing effect of it, to where it's more like, it's kind of following, but it's more of a smoothing effect, smooth effect of following. This right here looks like it's going dink, 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 but it's more of a smooth following of what's going on rather than quite so, you know, close. I find I use this way even on my out front tracks. This way I use every now and then when I really have to get really detailed because it's really noticeable and it's something I really have to affect when it's not quite so subtle. When most noise applications are pretty subtle, and I apply it like this, and it's pretty simple. I get in there, I make some dots as I'm going along, you know, start applying dots like that, you know, going along, and then I bring it up and down, and just kind of, you know, either, you know, bend the waveform where I need to follow things, or, you know, add dots to, you know, go up and down along, you know, basic flow of what's happening on the waveform that you can see as I'm going along here. And it's a pretty simple concept. It's not really complicated that I need to get in there and draw it all out for you. I mean, it's pretty simple. I go on there and I look at different levels. I make dots, dot, 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 along the timeline, and I start adjusting them until I get a fairly good, nice run of it, that it's kind of a smooth, you know, contoured look of the waveform, and I only normally stay down inside of it quite a bit. But as you get farther back in the mix, a lot of times you can just use block writing, to where you can just, you know, make a couple dots, use a tool like this to go up and down, and basically just get a lot of blocks happening and get a basic adjustment, you know, in different sections. You know, it'll section here, section here, section there. You don't have to be worried about it too much. And if you get some kind of thing happening to where it's something like this right here, you know, you can see that this block did come out to here, but I took and I seen it a little more contour than just straight blocks, put another dot there, and then just erase that one. So it's a little closer to the contour of what's happening. You know, does that make sense? To where it's still bap, 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 and really blocky, but this view is getting a little bit closer to this view, but it's not quite this detailed. Does that make sense? So the farther you get back in the mix, the less detail you need to be. I've found that most of my noise work is pretty subtle, so I stick with doing it pretty much like this and stay down inside of the waveform. And it's a pretty simple concept, you know, just drawing it out like that or using dots and adjusting it. And basically, once I've got that done, I'll go into here, make sure I got a dot outside here, set my timeline marker to that dot, highlight all that, command copy that, go down to the noise track that I want to put on, make sure that dot's at that first dot, command paste it after I've highlighted that track, and then I just go in there and adjust it. Like if I've got, like I find a good nice peak dot like that one right here, you can see a nice peak dot right there. So I go in here, line that one up. I'll highlight all those and drag it back and forth until I line up those two dots, and then I'm pretty much good to go. And then any place where I see complete dropouts, like you see a complete dropout right here, oops, sorry, you see a complete dropout right in this area. So I just basically, those two dots, you know, I brought the sound all the way down there, and then at the end and at the beginning here. Everywhere else, I just kind of let it fall along it. But I brought it down to where it's about midway. That means that we've got the dropouts down here, but it's not all the way up, it's not all the way down, it's somewhere in the middle, the range of it is. So like you would think the center of the smallest spot and the highest spot, about the middle of that you kind of want to put in the center of the track. And then once you get to the point to where you're ready to start bringing the noise in there, you can adjust it on the actual event of the noise. And you can command bounce these or duplicate these all the way across the track, and however much you need for the noise, and then command bounce them together. Does that make sense before you do your automation of them? And it's a pretty simple concept, because then you basically have your noise set up for your tracks. So you've got two separate tracks. Now, once you get done with this, we're going to go through and listen to it, but normally I would put this track, that's the track I'm working on, after I remove the automation from it. Once I've copied the automation and then put it onto the noise track down here, then I go back up here and then take the track that I'm working on and delete all the automation off it, so there's no automation on there. Does that make sense? So there's not any automation on that track, just on the noise file. And I'll put this track that is or however many noise files I have, and the track I'm working on into a pack folder, so they're in a separate folder. Now, when I get to the point where I'm really happy with it and I'm in the mix, then I'll go ahead and render this file right here. So let's say that I'm to the point to where I'm happy with that, and I just want to render this file. So transfer this to rendered audio, and I transfer this to rendered audio. Does that make sense? So I'd have, this is basically the file that I would have. And then I would just take this file up to the track that I'm working on up here. I'd lay it on top of it, just the noise itself, and then command bounce it. So it's kind of one of those kind of things that you would drag it up onto the file here that you're working on, this noise file that I've done here, and just drag it, lay it on top of the other file, enable something like play overlaps so that they'll play together, and then bounce them together. But at that point, you're pretty sure you're done work. That way you don't eat up a lot of processing power and things like that. But you can just leave them separate, but it just depends on how much noise work you do. You might just do some on the out front tracks. You might do some on, all of the tracks. If you're doing analog emulation, that you're more likely going to do the analog emulation on each track separately. That way it sounds more analog, like they were all recorded separately, so they're not going to have the exact same noise in phase with the other noise. They'll be out of phase of each other. It makes it sound more natural. Does that make sense? And even when you're doing your sculpting and things like that. But it's a pretty simple process, because all you just got to lay the track on top of it, and it's not a big deal to do that, because you just got two tracks there. This one goes right up on top of the other one. You've got play overlaps enabled. You can see them both on there, and then just command bounce them together. Now you have both those files, the noise file and what you're working on, bounce together after you've decided how much automation and how much noise you're putting on there and stuff like that. And basically you have it all done. And it's the same thing as if when we do the other processes, mixing them down onto the file, like if you got an EQ or something, or transfer it to render audio, same concept, or you just bounce that noise file right into this actual file you're working on. So it's a pretty simple concept. Now there's other couple of concepts that we'll look at. That we looked at that analog emulation. Sometimes you'll do analog emulation, and sometimes you do analog emulation and sculpting. So you'll have at least two files that you'll be working on that you'd have to do that kind of stuff with. Sometimes you have three. Sometimes you got like analog emulation, and you might have two other files that are like, this one's a violet blue noise that I've filtered with EQ to just be in the upper range, and then I have another one that's this brown, gray, and blue that I've used an EQ just to filter it so it's in the lower range of the vocal range. And it's a good idea always that whenever you're doing noise files to at least high-low pass filter out the extreme upper and the extreme lower end. That way there's most of the time there's not a whole lot of use for the extreme upper and extreme lower end whenever you're adding noise, because it's really not going to be audible, and it's more than likely going to cause audio artifacts and distortion that's not enhancing the audio. unless sometimes you got a sound that's really low or really high. Does that make sense? Because you end up with really hiss or boomy stuff in the lower end that you really just don't want. Because when I even do this brown, gray, and blue, there's a whole lot of lower end in there. So I kind of, filter out that. So there's not, just got a basic filter so I don't have an extreme lower end or extreme upper end. But sometimes I'll leave it, just depends. If it needs it, I'll check it. But, you filter out whatever you don't need is always a good idea. So with that in mind, basically what we're going to do is I've got a vocal here that I've recorded. I've got it sound one. It's been cleaned. I've EQ'd it a little bit and added just a little bit of reverberation so that it's not completely dry. But I've really not done anything else to it. And I just recorded it here through a fairly inexpensive microphone. And we're going to go ahead and listen to it, add some noise, and see how it comes out sounding. So you can see the actual application a little bit. And you have to keep in mind that it's really detailed work. And as you add more things, you add noise, saturation, distortion, harmonic content. It all, it all kind of comes together. So, you really got to keep that in mind when you're doing it. It's why I normally tell beginners to start with adding harmonic content and come at it the other way. That way you're adding the least audible things last. But through this segment, I'm going noise first and through up to going kind of backwards of that, because as you get better, you will understand you want to add just a little bit of noise and a little bit of saturation, maybe a little distortion, and then work on the harmonic content a little bit. You might have to re-EQ a little bit, and then bam, yeah, oh yeah. But yeah, as you start out, you might do that process in reverse for a little bit as you get more used to what happens when you add all those things together rather than just hearing how they sound by themselves. So get out your headphones and we're going to start applying some noise and hear what it does and hear how subtle it is most of the time, so that as you experiment with it, you understand how subtle it is. But it's going to affect the work you do later through the processes of sound sculpting. But that will take time for you to experiment with that. So let's get on our headphones and take a look at applying some noise.